Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss negotiations between the US and Russia aimed at ending the war in Ukraine and the reproductive career of one Elon Musk. I'm joined by Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So Ashley, there's a lot of dissatisfaction in Europe where you are with the negotiations that the Trump administration has initiated with Russia. What's the basic complaint?
Well, today, the absolute shock was that Trump said that Ukraine never should have started it. Never should have started it. They should have made a deal. And I feel like every single policymaker in the land, on the continent, all of their jaws collectively dropped. I don't know if you heard it echo over there, but it was a pretty shocking thing to say. And I just had this image in my mind of like all these war hawks like stumbling over each other, desperately trying to get to Trump's ear before he opens his mouth again. Because, you know, the rumor is, the joke is with Trump is that the person who has the most influence on him is the last person he spoke to. So I'm thinking, you know, who was it that he last spoke to, that he opened his mouth? And then, of course, you have, you know, all of these, he's got all these people around him who then have to kind of roll with it and run with what he's saying. And you can just imagine that they were like losing their minds over this. But, you know, I do wonder if Compact has been vindicated over this, because was not the stance, correct me if I'm wrong, when this all started, don't escalate things. Don't escalate things. There has to be some way out of this, or Ukraine's going to end up with less than they could, you know, reasonably hope for. And that seems to be what's happening now. So, you know, maybe Trump has a point.
Yeah, Ashley, you kind of talk about Compact stance. You, as our listeners know, we're a pretty heterogeneous project. People with a lot of different views contribute. But upon our launch, we published a collective statement, Away from the Abyss, signed by, you know, our friends, writers, editors, and it was really a caution against escalation and the a warning of the devastating consequences that would attend this war. And you know, we were skeptical of the much ballyhooed surge in 2023, and I think we've, you know, been vindicated. You know, there's been 1 million casualties. Ukraine has lost a generation. It's not in a position of regaining its territory. I understand the frustration from European leaders on this, but I think frustration is inevitable when you have pursued a disastrous course. Europe hasn't pursued that alone. It did so with the encouragement of the United States, which I think is one reason why people are frustrated at Trump's statement of blaming Zelensky for starting this war. It isn't like he was acting alone in this, okay? But when you've followed a disastrous course of action, getting out of it or resolving the situation is going to require some very painful choices.
I should say too, I don't want to sound like I'm, you know, dismissive of the cause of Ukrainians. Like I do understand the incredible frustration that they must be feeling. I do understand the desire for their own sovereignty, for a government that represents them. You know, all of that. I get it. But I mean, let's be real. It was never about high-minded ideals. You know, it's so interesting how, you know, Trump comes to the table and he's like, well, you know, let's just carve up the map. Let's just, you know, divvy up the proceeds. Let's make a deal, as though like this is something unique to him. He's just doing it in a way that's, you know, he's not hiding behind anything. He's not bothering to say, this is for freedom. This is for democracy. It was never about that, I don't think, to begin with. And that's why Western powers were chomping at the bit to go to war, to trying to tell us that Putin is the new Hitler and anything less is appeasement. So although I am extremely sympathetic, I and for Ukrainians it is about high-minded ideals. I think it was never about that for the powers that be.
Yeah, it does seem worth highlighting this element of Trump attempting to guarantee U.S. access to these rare earth minerals in Ukraine, which, as with many things, I wrote this piece about the sort of what the late Baudrillard book, The Agony of Power, for the Substack, so people can check it out at the Compact Substack. But one of the points I made there is that it's and this maybe is slightly complicating what Ashley just pointed out, that the move would appear to be towards a kind of brutal, harsh realism, which I think Matthew joked the other day. Trump is not a no blood for oil. He's a no blood for oil guy. He's a no blood without oil guy. And this does go back to his early arguments about the Iraq War, which were not, his criticism of it was not framed in kind of grandiose or moralistic terms. Instead, it was, we should have taken the oil, which I always found kind of a bizarre assertion, because it seemed to assume, I don't know. I mean, what that would actually mean, as I would understand it, is establishing some kind of satrapy or, de facto colony by which, somehow the U.S. state would control the extraction of oil. Because otherwise it sounds like he's saying something ludicrous, which is like, we should have just sucked all the oil out of the ground then and like put it in boats and taken it away. Which just seems bizarre. So, it kind of goes along with this attempt to use a kind of crudely economic notion of self-interest to paper over issues about how geopolitical, power relations actually work. So this whole we should have taken the oil point again would actually imply something sort of like what actually happened, right? Which is establishing a permanent U.S. military force that would protect the sites at which oil was being extracted to the U.S. benefit. But there's kind of a denial of that, or a kind of sidelining of that aspect of it in favor of this kind of purely economic, crudely materialistic logic. And you see something similar with this strange Gaza proposal, which I think we talked about before, where, on one hand, there's the assertion is simply that the U.S. will own Gaza as if it were a landowner, right? As if it were a property developer. And so the whole question of sovereignty, sovereign territory, is completely sidelined and sort of, placed outside of consideration. And instead, the move is justified in terms that don't really make sense in terms of how the order of the global geopolitical order is supposed to work, right? In other words, in terms of the divvying up of sovereign territories, and instead reconceives that as an entirely economic relation. And interestingly, you have him actually denying that there would be any U.S. troops involved in this quote unquote ownership of Gaza, which is sort of bizarre. I mean, there's sort of I suppose there's a way you could square the circle and say, well, there could just be a private, the hotel chains that would be, occupying this land could, simply hire their own private security to provide, to provide some sort of defense against, potential terrorist attacks or whatever. But nonetheless, it's a weird kind of diversion away from questions about territorial sovereignty, which I think is strange, particularly because Trump has been so assertive about territorial sovereignty when it comes to the United States itself, right? where there is a sense of the United States as a sovereign entity that has particular interests as such. But in terms of his approach and statements about geopolitics, they repeatedly come back to this bracketing of questions of national sovereignty in favor of questions of kind of purely, pure business relations. And so my question, going back to the agony of power, is to what extent this is real. I mean, it's being posited as just the most, brutally cold, calculating. Chris Cutrone in his piece about Gaza, quoted the famous passage from the Communist Manifesto about the kind of acidic effect of the bourgeois, logic, right, which kind of tears all traditional relations asunder and replaces them with, pure, crude, calculating logic. And so that is kind of what he's doing here. But then my question is this actually real, or is it itself some kind of strange performance? Is it, and I think there is, we're talking about a figure who, in his recent career, performed on TV the role of a businessman, and for whom, business activities were never entirely separable from spectacle and performance. And so, what I find odd about this, I think the Gaza case is maybe the most surreal. But, when he talks about Ukraine and, he's insisting on this sort of rare, whatever clause that would allow the US access to rare earth minerals, like, it's not clear to me whether that's a real expression of interest, of a kind of national interest, or if it's a kind of performance of the role of the crudely calculating businessman, trying to make sure that we take the oil so that we're not suckers like these idiot humanitarian leaders who, pour their money, their nation's resources into these, pointless enterprises that don't serve anyone's interest. But, is this minerals clause a kind of, is it real, or is it a kind of performance of the role of the crudely calculating, materialistic businessman using this brutal business logic to guide his foreign relations? And so, I suppose a final point here would just be, that there is a way that this and on the domestic front, it would seem there's a tension between Trump and his sort of Silicon Valley allies, many of whom, if you think about, a figure like Balaji Srinivasan, who's close to various of the other tech right figures in the orbit of the administration, has proposed this idea of the network state, which is essentially a version of Curtis Yarvin's ideas about, essentially remaking sovereignty along the model of corporate, of kind of how corporations function, right? And so, this is a very current idea in Silicon Valley circles that, we need to scrap the whole notion of national sovereignty and replace it with a pure kind of business logic. And, there's a weird way that this seems very much at odds with how Trump conceives of America on some level, even though there is this idea that he'll run it as a business. There is this strong investment in sovereignty in the sense of a nation as a sovereign entity, which is why he's at odds with these tech people on the H-1B visa debate, right? Or why some in the sort of more traditional MAGA coalition are at odds with these figures on the H-1B visa debate. But at the same time, in his foreign relations, he really is channeling this idea that's actually very current among the sort of techno-libertarians that, really we need to just reconceive of international relations as, business, as a kind of business enterprise. So, but then again, my question is this real, or is it some kind of performance?
Well, I mean, in terms of enacting an ideological policy abroad rather than at home, I mean, there's nothing new in that. Every time that these sort of like think tanks and policy wonks and big ideas, they never have the leeway to do it at home. And so the world is their playground. The sort of NGOs will enact the bleeding edge of all of these different, whatever the hot thing is at the time, therapeutic governance, resilience governance, all this stuff. That was, really powerful within, international development, like 30, 40 years ago, before anybody even knew what it was. And then they do that as a test case. Then they bring it home and suddenly it's on the front pages for us. And we're like, what the hell is this? And it's like, well, they've had that in Africa. That's what they've been doing all this time. But in terms of whether or not this is real, I find that so interesting because I don't want to do the stupid academic thing where you kind of like, what if the opposite is true? What if by doing, so when they claimed, when someone like George Bush claimed to be bringing democracy to Iraq, he was simply doing the stupid pragmatic thing of gutting the place for oil and all of that kind of stuff. But now, under the guise of being a pragmatist and just getting the oil, he really is bringing high-minded ideals of like bourgeois right, as opposed to, at least in his head, as opposed to like warmongering tribes and like religious hooliganism and all that sort of thing. He promises to like bring a sense of like bourgeois order in a bourgeois democracy.
Well, I think that's maybe the Cutrone argument, right? Something along those lines. That part of what this is doing or proposing is, and not just whatever sort of religious zealotry and hooliganism, but also permanent NGO dependency as a kind of as a kind of weird regressive model of rule, that you have these parts of the world where you have people who are essentially permanent dependents on the global NGO order and are therefore kind of excluded from, as you said, bourgeois right. And so, part of what this is doing is sort of saying, well, we'll get rid of that and replace it with a kind of, again, a kind of pure, crudely calculating business logic. But that is, in a sense, a kind of idealistic project, I suppose you could argue.
Exactly. It is, because it's like, well, the ideal is through contracts, you lock in your rights, right? What do you have when you have a warlord? You just have tit for tat. So it's incredibly idealistic in that context.
Right. Or when you're in a refugee camp and you're basically just waiting around for the latest handouts. You have no property rights. You have no ability to even be in the wage relation. Right.
We're also seeing, here in the U.S., a fair amount of controversy about Trump's, foreign policy. There's a sharp divide within his coalition within the right between kind of restraint and realism camp and more hawkish sectors of the Republican Party. You're seeing this in terms of the conflict over Elbridge Colby's nomination for a position in the administration. Colby is a foreign policy thinker who's viewed by some as insufficiently alert to the threat of Iran. My own view is that he has a very strong record of prudent reflection and commentary on foreign policy, and that he'd be an excellent addition to the administration. But there are other figures who are involved in the administration who are controversial. Advising Pete Hegseth is Dan Caldwell, a friend of Compact's, who's known for his involvement in the restraint and realism community. So it's part of the kind of broader dispute you've seen over, what exactly is the nature of Trump's foreign policy? Is he a dangerous person who's going to be lashing out at other countries, or does he pursue a more sensible and restrained policy? In his first administration, he liked to boast that he had John Bolton around to play bad cop as he played good cop in Peacemaker. And my assumption is that he's going to offer similar arguments about his second term, whether that's a convenient way of explaining away the contradictions of his coalition or the chaos of his administration, or if it's a real strategy designed to create strategic ambiguity and keep opponents on the back foot. But we all know the real news of the week is the claim offered by Ashley St. Clair, a conservative commentator and author of the children's book Elephants Are Not Birds, an anti woke bedside read for all of you based in red pilled, red blooded Americans out there.
It's basically it's like racist baby to Ibram X. Kendi's anti-racist baby, essentially.
I think in fairness to Ms. Claire, it is it's anti-trans baby to or anti-transgender movement baby to Ibram X. Kendi's anti-racist baby.
Turf baby.
Turf baby. And Miss St. Clair has announced on social media that she has given birth to Elon Musk's child. Musk hasn't commented on these claims, and Compact has not invested investigative resources in determining their veracity. But the claims occasioned pretty far-ranging controversy, really about the nature of the right, which, as those of us older than 25 or so may remember, once held itself forth with more reason than it's had in recent years as the defender and, to some extent, the exemplar of family values. Now, this was always dubious in various ways. Even as the right was going after Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich had his deviations from the high and straight path of righteousness. But it was once more plausible for the GOP to present itself as the party of bourgeois family values. And that was reflected not just in the relatively regular personal lives of its politicians in the pre-Trump era, but also by the makeup of its coalition, which was more upscale and professional class, more likely to be married and in stable unions with children born within wedlock, and in part reflecting the general breakdown of marriage in American society, and in part reflecting the downscaling of the GOP coalition that's changed for the Republican Party. And Musk, who has now fathered an alleged 13th child, is kind of making people ask, okay, what is the family ethic of the GOP today? What is that?
So it would seem to be, and Matthew, you yourself wrote something on Twitter or X to this point, which was, one way to describe it, which would be, of course, probably impugned by those who support these views as derogatory. But one way to describe it would be eugenicist. In the simple sense that they, like the original eugenicists, appear to value, identifying good genes and ensuring that they are propagated maximally. And so I think this is a worldview you can find different versions of on the right today. I think you can find a kind of hard version of it, which would be, I suppose, usually very racially inflected. And then you can find kind of softer versions of it, which, you do have to consider here that it isn't at all surprising that this kind of thinking would have traction, because it simply reflects the fact that people with the means to do so are increasingly able to, use the most advanced kind of genetic screening technologies to assist in their reproductive endeavors. And this is just a thing that's been going on for a while. but it didn't necessarily have sort of, I think partly because of the discomfort with the history of eugenics, which 100 and a bit years ago was a very respectable and often seen as progressive worldview, but was discredited for various reasons. That because there's a kind of stigma attached to that. This is something that people who had the means to, for really decades at this point, have been doing, but haven't really been avowing or making the case for, at least in the most robust version, right, of that there's a desirable collective project of improving society by improving the gene pool, right? Essentially by encouraging reproduction from the genetic elite, and by discouraging reproduction from people who right-wing commentator who would very much belong to this group, Richard Hanania, refers to as low human capital, right? And so, I think it's notable here that Elon Musk is himself somebody who not that long ago was seen as a relatively standard kind of Silicon Valley liberal Democrat, and these at least practices and approaches to reproduction are ones that you would find practiced among people of that outlook, even if they wouldn't attach them to this kind of explicit eugenic ideology. But because on the right there's been a desire to kind of question certain taboos and stigmas attached to certain things in recent years, there's been a kind of revival of, oh, well, maybe eugenics is good, actually, which you can find in the work of people like Hanania. And so what seems interesting to me here is that, if you go back a couple decades, you have a figure like Leon Kass comes to mind here as somebody who I think of as quite ubiquitous as a kind of commentator, op-ed writer, and so on, who was a sort of culturally conservative critic of things like assisted reproduction, embryo selection, and genetic screening. And was a very notable kind of figure in the world of bioethics and coming at it from a conservative standpoint. And he was, I believe, an advisor to the George W. Bush administration on these issues. There were various kind of controversies 20 years ago or so in which, in general, it was usually Democrats who didn't want these kinds of procedures to be restricted. These kinds of new assisted reproductive technologies to be restricted or limited, and it was Republicans, from the pro-life camp and more broadly the kind of religious and social conservative camp. Again, I think of Cass as somebody who's not as prominent anymore, but was a very significant figure in this realm back then, who made a robust kind of ethical argument against these technologies. And now, so now what's interesting is you have this accelerationist and eugenicist camp really right in the heart of conservatism. And, something that I found notable was less that, this announcement, that this woman who's a conservative influencer, and it's notable that her book is, Turf Baby or whatever, because I think there is kind of a tension here, right? Elon Musk, claims that he sort of was red-pilled in part by his experience of his daughter transitioning. I can't remember whether M2F or F2M, but of a child, one of his children, gender transitioning, and this being, described by him as sort of kidnapped by the woke mind virus or something along those lines. So, he traces his kind of red pilling and turn to the right to this. And, it does kind of raise these questions of like, okay, well, if some kinds of radical intervention in the body, using medical technology are acceptable, then, what places these other ones off limits, right? Which are generally seen as are kind of a bête noire of the right today, right? Which is like sort of, whatever, puberty blockers, these other kinds of transgender medicine. So, then the question is, if you're in favor of all of these procedures that, do radically remake the family, radically shift what it means to reproduce, and, clearly have an immensely disruptive kind of social impact. There's a strange tension in then kind of singling out this one set of procedures as being, horrifying and beyond the pale, but then, largely embracing and leaning into this broader range of technologies that are, in fact, probably much broader in their, if perhaps not as acute in their impact, they are far more widespread in their likely effects on society. I would argue.
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison, and I wonder if one way to think about it is that the what you might call individualistic eugenicism that is now current in our culture, whether that's people screening for uh, Down syndrome or other kind of genetic abnormalities, which is very, very hard to avoid if you're meeting with an OBGYN, or in some cases selecting for the embryos that seem to have the traits one would most desire, and then all the way up to gene editing. If you look at that on the one side, that's really the parents, so to speak, participating in the perfection or the creation of their child in deliberate and medically mediated ways. And a child gender transition, though, it's also a parent might play a role in that, but that's something that gives the child a chance to participate in its kind of medically mediated self creation or perfection on certain lines, to realize a higher or better state to make the body more expressive of a certain ideal, one that may be kind of innately felt as an identity rather than externally opposed as a kind of a math Olympiad / actual Olympian kind of ideal of physical and mental perfection. But there's this weird thing where for Musk it seems that medicine can be used to create the perfect child, but the child is not allowed to perfect its own body in line with its own ideas.
Yeah, and it's also worth just adding. Let me just add one more point to this, which is that this isn't this comparison is not totally abstract. Like, there are plenty of people who are making the connection between these different kinds of technologies, and if you look for if you look into the notion of accelerationism, which is often associated with kind of right-wing strains that perhaps Musk might be connected to within Silicon Valley. I mean, there are people who call themselves gender accelerationists, right, who explicitly argue for the embrace of all of these kinds of transformative technologies, and simply bundle various kinds of gender surgery, hormone treatment, things like that, within the same broader sense of, okay, we just need to use technology to enhance the possibilities of the human body. And and then there's also the fact that, like, when these people, if they want us all to sort of upload or interface our brains with the internet, then it's kind of unclear, like, what the role of the body, like, I actually don't understand, if you're Elon Musk and that's your ultimate dream, then why would you be fixated on the idea that one kind of bodily transformation, if you want to plant chips in people's brains that will kind of interface them with all the entire stream of digital information and kind of allow them to flip back and forth between virtual and real worlds, then why would you be so attached to, preventing a particular form of bodily transformation? It seems very odd to me. So I think, that there's and then the other thing that's interesting here is like the Silicon Valley rationalist world that Musk has a kind of history with and plenty of connection to, which, interfaces with accelerationism, gender accelerationism, is also a place where you find a lot of particularly, and I mean, I'm thinking here of this scandal about the Zizian cult, which involved these kind of, bizarre outgrowths of this rationalist community who are also predominantly trans, as I understand it. So, these things are all connected, right? They are. If you look at the Silicon Valley world, these things are not, or many people do not conceive of them as separate phenomena at all.
So there's so many points that I want to make now.
Do it.
I'm not going to make them all well. Okay. So why would they be against this kind of this sort of transhumanism, this like anything goes when it comes to body modification and this sort of weird futurism? Well, I don't know. I can't speak for them, but I can tell you. So I've often wondered why futurism often winds up being so reactionary. And part of my solution or my understanding of what goes wrong there is that you have this this push to kind of free humanity, to push the boundaries of technology, to push the boundaries of what's possible for the human body and modification and so on. But this pushes up against the need to control populations. So inevitably, those technologies become tools for the control of populations. Rather than freeing people, which was the ostensible goal, they become used more and more. So we don't want chips in our brain, not because we think we have some like worry about, I don't know, oh, maybe there's some kind of like weirdness of like modifying your body in that way. But we're always thinking, well, it's going to go both ways, isn't it? Like, we are so used to surveillance. We're like, we know immediately that's going to be another form of surveillance. But the way that these sort of body modifications are sold to people is not, this is an aspect of your absolute freedom, your own self-creation. It's not, and you're gonna like grow breasts and whatever, there's some extreme bits of that where it's like, you can have tulip shaped genitals or whatever. Like there are aspects of that go in that direction. But the way that it is sold is like, this is going to be a solution to your problems. So it is sold as a solution to problems. And in that way, it does become another form of containment. It sells people a kind of foundation and a solution to their quest for meaning and their sense of meaninglessness, as opposed to, and I'm not saying like people would revolt if medicine did not exist to tell them that their problems are in their bodies, like Ivan Illich style. But I think what people are searching for is they're searching for an essence that isn't there. And the gender ideology gave people an essence. It wasn't about absolute freedom. It was a lie that you are discovering something that was always there, that it was who you really are. You will discover who you really are. When the truth is, and the truth that I think the absolute extent of a kind of freedom-based transhumanism is that you are ultimately responsible for this, for what you become, for this project of who you are. You must take the blame. And who you will become is incredibly, terrifyingly open. It is so little determined by your birth. And in the face of that, it's like, no, because then I had to take responsibility for that. And so you're like, no, it's not me. It's my genes. It's my parents. It's my upbringing. It's my gender identity, which is innate at my birth, something like a soul. So there's desire to sort of go back and ground everything into some essence, some foundation, instead of facing the fact that there is nothing there, that you have to build that in the real world, that you have to build a foundation for what it means to be a man or a woman or a human being in the world. That's gone now. And the only thing you have is yourself. So yourself becomes a project, but not a project you actually have control over. It is a project of self-discovery, something that was always there, something that was there from the beginning, written on your soul. And if I could just say about this idea of like the conservatives were the protectorate of family values, the sort of children being born in wedlock and all of that sort of thing. Musk's pronatalism superficially kind of looks like this, which is where you have this common ground. But I actually think that there is a lot more common ground between someone like Musk and his thinly veiled eugenicist views and people on the left and the majority of the political spectrum. Is it really that different for someone like Musk to say only smart people should have children, and the common thing you hear from libtypes, which is you should have to get a certificate in order to have children? Really, we should have parenting classes in order to have children. Or they'll say that in all sorts of different kindly ways, like, oh, parenting is the hardest job in the world. We should really have more support for parents. But what they're really saying is that there's something that happens to you. There's some deterministic thing, like it's infant determinism, or it's neurodeterminism, or it's parental determinism, or it's pregnancy determinism. But everybody is saying you are really not in control here. What you become is determined at your birth. And it is, you said eugenics lost its respect, but I think it's still there. You have a huge, the medicalization thesis has been around since, the 60s or whatever, but it's morphed into like, now if you look at theorists, what are people writing about? Geneticization, psychiatrization. It's this deep and very widespread. There's tons of research dollars going into this, and it doesn't look left at all. It looks very like pragmatic and scientific, but all this money goes into these people who are saying, I'm going to solve this huge range of social problems if I could find the genes for this, or if I could, find this thing in the baby's brain that leads them to become a criminal, or if I could find this or that within the body of the person that leads to future social problems. I think that's actually a very old outlook. As a sociologist, I call that social pathology, and that was the eugenics outlook. That was the eugenics outlook. It said social problems are caused by some, anybody who went to sociology, you took it in high school, maybe you took it and you were forced to take it in a first year class. You learned about the organic analogy, right? The society is like a body and all the parts work together. And deviant is like a disease on the healthy body. How do you fix that? You cut it out, right? So deviant individuals are like cancers on the healthy body of society. That is still so powerful, and it's everywhere. It's across the political spectrum. But what Musk does is he says it outright. He says only smart people should have children. Everybody else got the memo from the 20s and 30s. You're not supposed to say that anymore. You're supposed to say, we need to support parents. I believe that parenting is the hardest job in the world. Hillary Clinton, the importance of the first 3 years. We really need to look at the brains of Romanian orphans in an orphanage. Look at the atrophy of that brain. It's terrible what child abuse does. And so clearly, what a parent does can atrophy the child's brain, they'll say. So, which is ridiculous because these are orphans that were like strapped to cribs, but they'll like extrapolate from that you are literally damaging your brain, the child's brain. And that is why we have social problems. It's the same kind of idea, and it is extremely widespread because we have, I've written about this before, instead of having a kind of anthropology or sociology for understanding social problems, we have a misanthropology. Let us study what is so messed up about humans, and we will find the answers to our social issues. Oh, but the social issues are still here. We still have poverty. We still have these problems. We still have crime. Man, people are worse than we thought. Let's go deeper. Let's look at the genes. Let's ensure that only these people are born. I mean, let's talk about overpopulation. Let's talk about how important it is for to have birth control in Africa, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it operates in a million different guises, but it is an extremely powerful outlook that basically says, if you want to solve the social question, look no further than the brain of the individual. That's Musk, that's Clinton, that's everybody. We have given up hope on actually looking outside ourselves to the world beyond ourselves and maybe saying, hey, maybe we could like bridge that gap between what is and what ought to be out there instead of in the genome.
I also want to mention an article that we published some months ago by Daryl Paul, Compact columnist. The title is The New Fertility Inequality. And in it, he really questions Musk's natalism. Musk has talked a lot about declining birth rates, but it should be noted that Musk now has an alleged 13 children with 4 different women. That's not the fertility is measured by female fertility, not by male fertility. It's not really that many children per woman when you uh, break it down. Uh, but the more fundamental point is that Musk is participating in and uh, promoting uh, a kind of inequality where certain high status men have more mates, more access to mates, and low status men don't. And the best way to ensure that people have more children, if that's really your concern, is to make it easier for people to get married, which requires men of all social classes to have stable, remunerative employment and status to be able to marry and be stable mates. And this just is not the political vision that Musk has been promoting. Uh, Instead, it's about amping up the inequality, destroying uh, any kind of moral or economic regulation aimed at distributing these goods more widely. And the notion that Musk is going to take us back from the brink of low birth rates is completely wrong. Paul argues, and I think it's convincing. So recommend that piece to our readers.
Yeah, and another one of our writers who, I don't know, it's been a while since he's written for us, but Paul Embury, I was just talking to him recently, and he's been advocating for a family wage, and the utter vitriol that he has got from the left for like having the temerity to argue that you should get paid enough to take care of a family is just absolutely unbelievable. But what people don't realize is like we've made it so that having a family is a privilege that requires all these resources, and that's just totally taken for granted. You ask people like, oh, why don't you have children? Oh, I can't afford it. Really? I mean, like, that never stopped anybody in the past. I mean, I come from some Irish stock and indigenous stock. We just friggin' had kids like nobody's business. Like, we got dirt to eat, we're having babies, that never stopped anybody in the past, but we've imbibed this totally, like, utterly
Compact does not
cowed
endorse
ourselves.
these gross stereotypes that Ashley is applying to her ancestors.
It's pretty recent. I have like 45 first cousins or something. But like, we've completely and utterly imbibed this, utterly cowed ourselves, and we're saying, oh no, oh, I'm going to be a good little citizen, and I'm not going to have any children until I can afford it, and I'm in good stable work. Well, you're not. What's happening to stable work? It's on its way out. And I will not dare demand any more. No, you should demand more. Why are you complaining about a housing crisis? You want a house because you want to have a family. That's what you want. Say it. It's okay. We want families. It's a good thing to have.
I was just going to point to one interesting kind of esoteric element of American history that I think Musk is kind of inadvertently reviving, which is, the original vision of polygamy that Joseph Smith developed. Really was. It wasn't quite. I mean, it was much more sci-fi than what it actually became for the period that it existed in Utah. It was kind of this idea of having this kind of network of spirit wives, and there wasn't necessarily the idea that you would create a kind of polygamous household or anything like that. In fact, Smith really saw. I mean, it was much closer to certain kinds of free love concepts that you saw spreading in New England and upstate New York in the same period, where some of the wives that he took were actually married to other men, and there was kind of a notion that maybe women could, it wasn't just polygamy, in that it seemed to include women being able to be multiply partnered too. And there was really this emphasis on producing spirit children, and I mean, it did have this kind of this very sci-fi aspect, which kind of ties into this sort of, that there is this theological doctrine about, ascending spiritually to the point where you kind of become a god on your own planet. That this is an esoteric doctrine of early Mormonism, And basically, it seems that Musk, with his combination of this kind of model of having this network of sort of spirit wives who aren't necessarily part of your household, but are producing these kinds of these progeny who will then hopefully go and kind of populate other planets, which will be ruled by these sort of godlike Ubermenschen. So he is actually picking up this kind of, and I think part of this is that Joseph Smith himself was conversant in the kind of weird spiritualist literature of the period and these kind of ideas that were circulating. And so it wasn't entirely original to him, but what I find interesting here is it could be that Musk is actually fulfilling some kind of esoteric Mormon prophecy with by and I'd also note that Trump, a couple days after this Ashley St. Clair thing, signed this executive order expanding access to IVF, which I suppose raises a whole other set of questions we'd have to discuss.
It's related, right, Geoff? Because the executive order, what it'll do isn't specified yet, but the mandate is to find ways to promote access and decrease costs around IVF. No talk of promoting access and decreasing costs around adoption, around childbirth more generally. People who avail themselves of IVF tend to be professional class people who are marrying later in life, are more intense users of the medical system and more trusting of it. People who want to have families that are designed in the right ways. So the fact that the Trump administration is prepared to really put its weight behind IVF over and above other forms of reproduction, over and above adoption, shows a favoritism or prioritization of the reproductive aspirations of this more, this ostensibly fitter class of people. These people who are the real consumers of and people who identify with these eugenic or quasi-eugenic goals. And so there's something brewing here in the Republican coalition. I think it's something that people who have a different vision of human reproduction, including very much social and religious conservatives, they need to ask themselves whether this can really be reconciled with their notions of the kind of society we should be building.
Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but what's interesting about that is that there's every time I hear about something that, conservatives are doing, I'm like, this is just like the flip side of what the libs were doing, which is, IVF, who the preferred parent, the preferred recipient of IVF has been for clinics? Gay couples, and in particular lesbian couples. That has been the ideal. It was just, it used to be just like whatever parents who couldn't have children for whatever reason. And now it's very specifically gay and lesbian parents. So it's this kind of social engineering. There's this belief, there was this sense that these couples would be better parents because they wouldn't be duped by the patriarchy. They would hold the right values, the right ideas in their heads. This is why, for instance, if you look at how the European Union, which is like the epitome of all this junk, they can't bring themselves to say family. They like vomit while they're saying family. But they will say, and they can't say mother. You go through, you'd be shocked to find that there are any mothers in Europe. This word is gone from anything. You have to like search 75 pages of 9-point font to find the word mother. But what they will say is they will gush endlessly about our wonderful rainbow families. I can't say enough about this is a direct quote. I can't say enough about our fabulous rainbow families. These are the only families that matter because in their minds, they have the right values. They don't need the re-education that the rest of the working class needs in order to raise their children properly. They will already be free of the patriarchy, which really, they don't really care about the patriarchy. What they care about is labor mobility. They want women to work, and they want them to be able to be free to go and chase wherever the work is. So it's really just the same kind of idea. It's this kind of social engineering, but through a kind of liberal lens.
Well, we're reaching our end time, and I just want to make clear that we did not stoop to low discussions of Elon Musk's sex life, since, as a rule, he produces his children outside the sexual act. So we are still high-minded. We're still serious. This is not a tabloid thing. We're talking about reproduction, but emphatically not about sex. And with that, thank you, Geoff. Thanks, Ashley, and thanks, listeners.